Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy, though I fear that my guest's camera may have cut off here. So we'll get to that in a second. Oh, there he is. All right. Today we're going to be talking about the John Birch Society. You might have heard the name in passing. Many people will discuss the Buckley purges of the right wing. Some will say it as a celebration. Others will say it as if it's some kind of travesty for the conservative movement. But very few people actually get into the history of these purges. Who's involved? What were groups like the John Birch Society? Why were they turned away by the mainstream gatekeepers at the time? And why are many of them returning back in different forms today? Joining me today to discuss this is a journalist and author, Alex Newman. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me, Auron.
Absolutely. So before we jump into the John Birch Society, maybe you can give people a little bit of background on what you do, since people are probably unfamiliar with some of your work.
Well, thanks again for having me. And I'm a journalist. I write about a lot of different issues. I serve as senior editor at the New American Magazine, which is an affiliate of the JBS. And in that capacity, I've actually spent a lot of time studying this very issue. In addition to that, I write for and have written for a huge array of publications in the United States, around the world, including some establishment-minded publications. My work has been in Newsweek. I write regularly for the Epoch Times and a lot of other publications. I also do a lot of books. My latest one, Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx Won the Battle for Education and How We Can Take It Back, with Robert Borton, CEO of Classical Conversations. And homeschool dad, 6 children, Christian and patriot. But my job is journalism, and so I do my best to try to get the facts and explain them in a way that people can understand them.
The rare patriot journalists, so few, so many are needed. All right, well, Alex, let's dive into the topic at hand then, since it sounds like you are the perfect person to discuss it with. I guess we'll just start from the beginning. Who were the Birchers? What is the John Birch Society? Why was it founded?
So the JBS was started in 1958 by a candy manufacturer named Robert Welch. He looked around at the situation in the United States, an incredibly brilliant individual, homeschooled. He was basically done with school by the time he was 12, enrolled at the University of North Carolina, got his degree by the time he was 16, and then went to Harvard. And as part of his homeschooling, he read everything he could find in terms of history books, and he realized that we had a big problem in this country. He argued that we were facing an organized attempt to really destroy the United States as a free society, and an effort to build a totalitarian one world system, which, granted, in 1958 wasn't common knowledge. We didn't have the internet. People didn't know about George Soros and the Rockefellers, and all this stuff. So he convened a group of very successful businessmen in Indiana, gave them a presentation about the nature of the threat that he saw. And he really had in mind kind of the Soviet Union, the communist infiltration of American institutions, and argued that if we were going to survive as a free society, we needed an organized effort to oppose that and to promote what he described as less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. So some of the co-founders would be, of course, very recognizable to people. Fred Koch, the patriarch of the Koch dynasty that created Koch Industries. We all know Charles Koch, the libertarian today. Alfred Kohlberg, a very successful Jewish businessman. Just titans of industry, very, very well-known, powerful figures in their day. And that was really the goal, organized resistance to this tyrannical agenda to preserve and protect our constitutional republic and our God-given freedoms. But very early on, the commies figured out that this was a formidable group. Membership was rising rapidly. It went up to about 100,000. And the commies realized, this is not going to be good if these people get traction. And so they launched an organized smear attempt. The Communist Party propaganda mouthpiece in the United States, People's World, ran a hit piece. Some of those lies were then regurgitated in establishment publications. But the JBS is still here. It has been, as my friend Gary argues, the vanguard of the Americanist cause. It's named after the great John Birch. People should know who he is, although very few people do. He was a Christian missionary. He was born from missionary parents in India, ended up going to China to try to preach the gospel there and bring people to Christ. World War II broke out while he was there, and a lot of people will know Doolittle. And their airplanes basically crash landed behind enemy lines. Captain John Birch rescued them, and so he was then commissioned as an intelligence officer with the U.S. Army. Kind of served in the OSS, the precursor to our intelligence agencies. And he was eventually murdered by the Chinese communists, who at that time, at least according to the establishment, were our allies, right? We were supposedly allied with them. So they murdered him. The U.S. government tried to cover it up. And great American, great man of God. And so the government tried to conceal that. Robert Welch found out about it. So he asked John Birch's parents, can we name our society after your son? They said yes. They became honorary life members. And so that's kind of the genesis of this. And, for now 67 years, the JBS has been working really through education to try to raise the level of understanding among Americans and now increasingly worldwide of the threats that our freedoms face and how we can protect our liberties in the face of this really organized attack.
Well, as you say, this is certainly an organization that's well ahead of its time. Today, the fact that our elites are working together to create a one world government is kind of the most obvious thing in the world. They just kind of announce it. They hold organized meetings about it to celebrate it and, kind of clap each other on the back for their efforts to create exactly that kind of organization. So it seems far from wild now, but one wonders why it was even smeared as wild then. I think we look at the way that the McCarthy era is treated and kind of the misnomers that swirl around kind of the state of America's relationship with communists inside of the country. You look that even guys like James Burnham were writing, I think it was A Web of Subversion is the book about communist infiltration. Mainstream guys who had access to the National Review were acknowledging this truth. So why was the fact that the Birchers were talking about being anti-communist, why did that stick out among the different conservative coalitions?
Well, early on, JBS found a lot of support with major conservatives. In fact, Robert Welch was friends with William Buckley. He actually helped him start National Review, gave him money to start National Review. And so, there was a lot of synergy there. But Robert Welch realized that what we were dealing with here was not just a communist conspiracy. Communist conspiracy was okay. You could say that, you could be in Congress and safely say, hey, there's a communist conspiracy. They're trying to infiltrate our institutions. But Welch eventually realized that this was even bigger than that. He realized that there was even a power behind the communist movement that really was diabolical in the truest sense of the word, with a plan to overthrow freedom and overthrow free societies. And there came a point where William Buckley, there's a lot of ideas about why he may have done this, but there came a point where William Buckley said, nope, that's too far. And so he actually used his magazine, National Review, to denounce the John Birch Society. First, Robert Welch, he specifically said, I'm not attacking the Birchers. They're nice people, great stuff. But their leader, Robert Welch, has got a problem. And, he argued that the JBS was too conspiratorial. As you pointed out, today we all see this, right, that there is a totalitarian effort to build a one world government. But if you go back to the 70s, that was not obvious. Welch did predict that as we got closer to the end stage of this, they would do the equivalent. What he said was the equivalent of running naked through the streets. And I think we're getting close to that phase now where, whereas what they once said, oh, you're being a kook. How dare you say there's a plan to create a world system? They would say, hey, why wouldn't you want a world system, right? If we don't have a world system, we're going to have chaos, we're going to have war, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're in that stage. But William F. Buckley, I think if conservatives today knew all the facts about his record, they would be pretty concerned, right? William Buckley notoriously was a defender of the United Nations. The best thing you could say about the UN is that a waste of money for the dictators club. He was a proponent of what he described as a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores to combat the alleged communist method. How you combat tyranny with tyranny, it's kind of like COVID, right? Doesn't really make sense. You can't comply your way out of it. And so all these things combined, and he went on this tirade and suggested that Robert Welch was basically going overboard. And one thing in particular that I think really set off Buckley and some of his allies was what started as a private letter. You can buy a copy of it today. I would encourage people to do it. It's called The Politician. Robert Welch essentially examined Eisenhower and said, we have a problem here, right? And he looked at a whole bunch of things. He looked at Operation Keelhaul, where Eisenhower led the effort to deport millions of Soviet refugees back to Joseph Stalin so that they could be murdered, tortured, butchered, etc. He basically handed Cuba to Fidel Castro on a silver platter. Now, once Castro announced that he was a communist, he said, wow, only a prophet could have predicted that Castro was a communist, because you had the New York Times saying he was a freedom fighter. You had Herbert Matthews, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, kind of deep state headquarters here, saying he was the George Washington of Latin America. But Robert Welch warned he's a communist. The U.S. ambassador to Havana, Earl Smith, said U.S. government stop supporting this guy. He's a communist. So the arguments against Eisenhower really drove Buckley and some of the other kind of establishment conservative gatekeepers crazy. But I want to add this here, Auron. A lot of people don't realize this. They say, well, Welch attacked Eisenhower. He was a war hero. Well, the only person to serve 2 terms in Eisenhower's administration, Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson, agreed with Robert Welch. In fact, he said Welch is correct in his assessments of Eisenhower. He encouraged people to read that letter, and he ended up calling the John Birch Society the most effective non-church organization in the global fight against communist slavery. So there's a lot of facts that people don't know. If they did know, they'd be very alarmed. And, today the spin masters have concocted a narrative out of thin air, right? Every once in a while you'll see, and I assume it's mostly ignorance, but every once in a while you'll see some neoconservative writer in the New York Times or the Washington Compost say that Welch was exiled from the conservative movement by Buckley over anti-Semitism or racism, something like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, while Welch was arguing against segregation, William Buckley was promoting segregation in the pages of his magazine. He had a whole article that he did in his magazine, National Review, that he called on Negro inferiority and white superiority, where he argued that blacks were inherently backwards and shouldn't be allowed to vote, and whites would be justified in using violence to prevent them to vote. So they've really distorted the history. Every once in a while you hear the anti-Semitism smear, which totally silly. There actually have been Jews involved in the JBS, including at the leadership level from the time of Welch's first meeting. But that gives you some of the kind of the context behind the attacks, the smears, and what the media likes today to call the purge of the extremists by the respectable gatekeepers like William Buckley.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like I said, it's almost never discussed in any real sense. It's just, well, Buckley got rid of the kooks, like the JBS, and usually if they bother to explain it at all, the explanation is, oh well, they called Eisenhower a communist. They called him a communist agent, and that's why they were expelled. Did he actually end up accusing Eisenhower of being an agent of Soviet Russia?
He did not, actually. He gave this whole dissertation. Again, it started as a private letter that he circulated among friends, but once it became public, he published it as a book. But he lists all of these different things really troubling, right? Giving China to the communists, giving Cuba to the communists, deporting all the Soviet, expanding the size and scope of government. And he said there are several possible scenarios that could explain what's going on here. One of those scenarios, he said, was that Eisenhower was a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy. Another was that he was being used and manipulated by communists. But ultimately, when you look at the role of Eisenhower in advancing the cause of communism, you have to seriously consider those scenarios and say, which one is the most likely to be true. And I would encourage people, before just relying on what you learned in your fake history textbook or what you heard on Wikipedia or the fake news about Eisenhower, go back and read the information that Welch compiled in this document. Again, today you can get it as a book called The Politician, and make up your own mind. And you tell me if you have an other explanation other than what Welch came up with, the different scenarios that could explain it. I would love to know it. Frankly, I don't know what was in Eisenhower's heart. I know he had a reputation as a war hero from World War II, but you have to explain these things. You have to explain Eisenhower's role in handing Eastern Europe to the communists, in handing refugees back to Stalin, in handing the most populated nation on earth to the communists. And, I think Americans are owed an explanation here. And if it was just innocent mistakes, okay, so be it. But let's see the evidence.
One of the other things that's usually cited for the reason that an organization like the John Birch Society is so dangerous is that people will say, oh, they oppose the Civil Rights Act, which is always a strange attempt to even disqualify someone, of course, because, so did Barry Goldwater, who is still held up as a, titan of the conservative movement. People often, kind of hold him up as the last true kind of libertarian option for conservatives. And so did the JBS oppose that? And if so, why is that devastating when other conservative heroes held the same position on principle?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And ironically, a lot of the people who bring that up are Democrats, and they must forget that almost the entire Democratic Party also opposed the Civil Rights Act for different reasons, of course. Now, Welch and the John Birch Society opposed the Civil Rights Act for a very simple reason. It was unconstitutional, and it remains unconstitutional. If for those non-constitutional scholars, go pick up a copy of your Constitution, read Article 1, Section 8. It's got all the powers that have been delegated to the U.S. Congress, and find anything on there that authorizes the Congress to tell businesses what they have to do, that tells people they cannot have freedom of association. Now, Welch was always very opposed to segregation and to racism. In fact, he would kick racists out of the society. There were many, many Black Americans, including some of the greatest Black Americans of that time, were proud members of the John Birch Society, people like George Schuyler. And what's really funny about this, Auron, the main piece of evidence that they use to say, well, the John Birch Society opposed the Civil Rights Act, is a flyer that the Birch Society put out that says, what's wrong with civil rights? And they just show that little piece of it. Right? Well, right underneath it, it says nothing, right? Civil rights are good. We're opposed to a Civil Rights Act because it dramatically expands the size and the scope of government far beyond what the Constitution allows. And of course, we see today that the Civil Rights Act was the battering ram that they used to enforce a whole bunch of other crazy stuff. Most recently, it was used by Biden and Obama for the transgenderism and the homosex stuff. It has been used as a bludgeon against conservatives, against institutions. And as Welch very frequently pointed out, racism was ending. Racism and segregation and all these things were on their way out the door, except for the fact that the establishment was stirring this stuff up precisely for the purpose of accumulating and usurping more power in the hands of a centralized federal bureaucracy. And all those predictions that were made, if you go back and read them, what you'll find is they've all come true. Yet something that people don't want to talk about. And yes, the JBS did oppose some of the high-profile civil rights leaders. And I think if people knew the reasons why, they'd say, wow, that's a good point. I wish I had known that. A lot of the civil rights leaders were either themselves card-carrying members of the Communist Party USA or were surrounded by card-carrying members of the Communist Party USA. And that even includes some of the people that you can't talk about, like Martin Luther King, his handlers, his chief speechwriter. We've got all this now from the federal documents, were involved with the Communist Party. So the Birch Society has always been clear. We support what the Declaration of Independence says, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that doesn't grant the federal government the power to micromanage businesses. It doesn't grant them the power to interfere with freedom of association. And if you want something like that, well, let's have a debate. We can pass a constitutional amendment as outlined in the Constitution itself.
Well, and it's just obvious that every fear about this was realized to the point where it's now 2026 and I can't get conservatives to say, well, maybe we need to roll back parts of the Civil Rights Act, because we're so used to being able to dictate to every organization, every company, every educational institution in the United States exactly how it's going to staff itself, how it's going to conduct its business, how it's going to operate, that they can't even imagine a world in which the government does not have the power to force all of these things down. Again, that's the conservative part of the society. So I guess with all of this anti-communist work, why did Buckley ultimately, do you think, turn? You kind of said, well, at some point he decided they were too much, but was there any animating specific, if it wasn't Eisenhower, if it wasn't, some of these other things, why was the JBS so dangerous? Why would he want an anti-communist organization espousing what are basically mainstream conservative beliefs at the time? Why would he want to run them off?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I don't know what was going on in the man's heart and in his mind, but there are some very troubling signs involving William Buckley. He was a member of what's called the Skull and Bones Society at Yale University. This should be a well-known organization. Both Bushes were members. John Kerry is a member. They recruit a tiny little handful of people out of Yale every year, about 15 each year. And the really strange organization, massively overrepresented on the Supreme Court and the Congress among CEOs. And that's kind of strike one. Strike two, he was involved in the Council on Foreign Relations. This is really the primary globalist institution in America. It is not a secret society. I mean, they have a website. You can see their membership list on the internet today, but incredibly influential. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, gave a little talk at their when they opened their new office in Washington, D.C. And she said, oh, it's great to have an outpost of the Council on Foreign Relations here in D.C. Now I won't have to go as far to be told what I should be doing and how I should be thinking about the future. So do we think that the leader of the conservative movement would be involved in the same organization that tells Hillary Clinton what she should be doing and how she should be thinking. That's a little bit suspicious, right? The CFR is a very shady organization. I would encourage people to look into it. It's something that I've had my eyes on for a very long time. And unfortunately, they bring in a lot of fake conservative gatekeepers, a lot of rhino leaders come into the CFR. But if you read their own magazine, you'll see what the goal is. It is to subvert the sovereignty of the United States. The great Admiral Chester Ward, who spent 16 years as a member and then defected, ended up writing a whole book about it. It's called Kissinger on the Couch. He wrote it with Phyllis Schlafly. And what he explains in there is that the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is to promote the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and our submergence, he says, into an all-powerful one-world government. He says the term of revulsion, carrying the worst meaning among CFR members, is America first. All right. And this is from an admiral in the U.S. Navy defecting and saying these things. So the CFR is very shady. Why would William Buckley be involved in a group like that? That's strike two. Last but not least, he had a long and very mysterious career with the Central Intelligence Agency. You see, he was stationed in Mexico working for the CIA. Is that the kind of person, secret society, globalist organization membership, and intelligence community operations, who should be considered the leader of the conservative movement? You look at the public policy positions he took. He supported abortion. He supported, like I said, totalitarian bureaucracy. He supported our continued membership in the United Nations. It seems like on all the key issues, he was on the wrong side and neutralizing conservative efforts to stop that. Just recently, it came out that he was the man responsible for purging everybody who was asking hard questions about immigration, mass migration in the early 1990s. So it wasn't just the JBS. He also went after, Ayn Rand. And I'm not an objectivist. I'm not a Ayn Rand disciple, but I love her books. And I think what she had to say deserves to be heard. She made some very compelling philosophical arguments about freedom and free markets. So Buckley, to me, and again, this is just my personal opinion, but Buckley to me seemed to be kind of a gatekeeper, working for the establishment, working for the insiders, working to make sure that conservatives could talk conservative, but never really become an effective resistance against this organized effort to subvert our freedom.
So I'd say probably about 6 months ago, Tucker Carlson discussed William F. Buckley and his purges. I think maybe Dave Smith was the guest at the time. And this created quite the uproar all of a sudden. It's, how could you speak poorly about William F. Buckley, hero of the conservative movement? The guy who conserved nothing and led us to chopping off children's genitals. I don't know the argument, I guess, ultimately for William F. Buckley, except he was there. But you did see a lot of people get really offended about the idea that Buckley's purges had not been ethical, that his gatekeeping was not something to be proud of. One of those guys was somebody like Ben Shapiro, just kind of scoffing. How could you question the sanctity of William F. Buckley and his purges? Why is even, after we see the truth about communist infiltration, we can go back now, we have the records, we have the evidence. When you look at the obvious fact that one world governments are the kind of the general point of every Western nation now is to try to forge some kind of one world government. When you have that level of evidence where people are actively doing the very thing that the John Birch Society predicted, why is someone like Ben Shapiro saying, yeah, these guys are dangerous, great thing that Buckley got rid of them? How can we have that much evidence in the modern world and still the kind of the mainstream conservatives line is, good thing we got rid of those dangerous kooks?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Auron. And I think the people who make those arguments can be broadly divided up into two categories. There are the people who are just ignorant. I have been in and around institutional conservatism my entire career. I've worked for a lot of the big organizations. I've had good relations with a lot of the people at the DC think tanks. And, a lot of them, they graduate from college and they go through their training programs and they hear about this great guy, William F. Buckley, who kind of helped advance the conservative cause. And so they don't really know the details of it. They just know that, well, hey, that's what I'm supposed to think. And so, I don't know any different, so I'll just go along with that. Then you have the people, and I don't know which category Ben Shapiro might fall into, but then you have the people who I think are serving the same kind of role as William F. Buckley. People who are deliberately using language that appeals to conservatives, people who are deliberately trying to gain the trust of conservatives, not for the purpose of conserving anything, or at least nothing, beyond 10 or 20 years. Right now, conservatives want to conserve the same crazy ideas liberals were spouting 10 or 15 years ago. That's where we are. And I think
conserve gay marriage, Alex. We have to conserve gay marriage.
Right? It's a perfect illustration of this, right? And we have conservatives defending multi-trillion-dollar federal budgets. This would have been unthinkable 15 or 20 years ago. We have conservatives trying to conserve the very things that the liberals were pushing less than 2 decades ago. And so I think the establishment, if you will, the insiders, as Robert Welch called them, they've always understood that Americans are a, generally speaking, conservative, Christian, Bible-believing people. And if you're going to take over America, you can't just use the liberals. I mean, liberals almost a dirty word among normal Americans, the kind of people who fix your truck and keep the roads running, the normal people that they need votes from. So there's always been, at least in the modern era, an effort to prop up fake leaders to, at the very least, neutralize people who might oppose this, conservatives, Christians, true patriots, and in some cases, even use them for destructive purposes. The Soviet Union was really, really good at this, right? They would prop up fake leaders and say, he's the leader of the resistance to communism or the resistance to Stalin or whatever. They'd attract all the people and then maybe divert them into something harmless, or worse, round them all up later. So we would be very naive not to realize that the enemies of freedom are organized, that these are the kinds of strategies that they use. And by the way, they continue to use to this day. And I suspect that William Buckley fell in that category. And I suspect that a lot of the people today who are conserving the liberal ideas of 10 or 20 years ago are in that same camp. They are agents, witting or unwitting, for those who want to steal our freedom and create this one world system.
So I think a lot of people would look at kind of post-World War II and the environment around that. And we know at some level there was a large amount of communist infiltration. We can recognize that now. But I think a lot of people would look at someone like William F. Buckley, or just kind of the general conservative, capture apparatus, control apparatus, why they would be working so hard to kind of move America in this direction. Was there no true resistance to communism or globalism? Was the entire American right kind of post a Buckley purge simply, some kind of containment operation, some kind of controlled opposition? What was the mentality there? Does a guy like Buckley think he's actually saving the American right, or is it nefarious? Is it really just a web of control to try to keep any actual opposition to kind of globalization from coming to the forefront?
In my opinion, Buckley was a dedicated gatekeeper for the establishment. There's a really good book on this written by my late friend John McManus. It's called William Buckley, Pied Piper for the Establishment, where he lays out a devastating case against William Buckley. Ignorance can be forgiven. Being misdirected can be forgiven, but being a conscious enemy of the movement you claim to be leading, that's unforgivable as far as I'm concerned. And I think William Buckley really fell into that category. Again, when you look at his history, when you look at his connections, when you look at the people who propped him up, today, if we saw a conservative all over PBS, all over the pages of the Washington Compost, if the New York Times told us this is the leader of conservatism, we'd say that's ridiculous. Since when does the New York Times define the leader of conservatism for us? And we would all recognize that. But if you go back to the 70s, back to the 80s, we didn't have the internet then, right? People were very naive. People didn't realize the scope of the line. So I think really, when you look at Buckley and some of the other fake conservative leaders that have been propped up for us, I have to conclude that they were agents for the insiders, that they were wittingly and consciously working to neutralize real conservatism. And I think that's why the obsession with purging the John Birch Society and other dissident groups that might have actually posed a real threat. Now, they like to pretend like they succeeded in purging them. Of course, that was never true, right? Despite William Buckley's best efforts, the John Birch Society continued. There were governors, and there still are to this day. There are Birchers everywhere in Congress, in the state legislatures. There have been Birchers who've been at the highest levels of the U.S. military, the governors, CEOs of major companies. There are Birchers everywhere. Not all of them, run around bragging about it. It's kind of a quiet effort. But he never really succeeded. And if you look at the history of the Birch Society, it's distributed well over 1 billion pieces of literature, even among kind of establishment and establishment adjacent conservatives. A lot of them read the John Birch Society's publications. A lot of them read the books published by the John Birch Society. And this is well known, even in kind of establishment conservatism. So as much as they like to pretend, they like to promote this narrative that Buckley purged anyone, the reality is that's simply not true. And some leftists, incidentally, Auron, are starting to recognize this. Over the last few years, you've had a lot of high-profile leftists. G. Tier, one of the big editors over at Mother Jones and New Republic, did a really interesting thing where he said Trumpism is Birchism, and the John Birch Society won, and conservatism is now basically the John Birch Society. And you've had a lot of people saying this. People like Matthew Dallek just did a big book on this. More and more, they're starting to recognize that the purges were more a narrative, a fiction concocted by people like Buckley and his establishment promoters than actual reality.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get in with you, to just kind of talk a little bit about what the JBS is doing today. We'll definitely do that here a little bit towards the end of our discussion. But I did want to ask you this. I'm somebody who is obsessed with the work of James Burnham, the Managerial Revolution, his understanding of the way that our politics developed. I wrote a book called The Total State, which built upon this. And it's my, at least in my understanding, the one world conspiracy, I guess you could call it, the desire towards one world government is both, I think, something that, obviously has always been a dream of a certain type of person, especially a leftist, but this idea of unifying the world and creating this one world government has been a long running theme in secret societies and other things for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that's not new in and of itself. But I think what we're experiencing post the Industrial Revolution, post the Managerial Revolution, is a large amount of incentives that drive pretty much every government towards globalization, the economic realities, the geopolitical realities, the acceleration in technology, transportation. All of these things shorten the distance we need to interact with each other, which also means it shortens the distance governments need to control one another, interact with one another. Our elite classes now share more with each other than they do with the people that they rule over, building this kind of natural disdain for the people that are below those who see themselves as elevated and those that see themselves as educated and worthy of controlling the globe. And so I don't know if it's so much a conspiracy, though I do think conspiracies happen all the time. The old joke is a conspiracy is called lunch, right? Like, I think that's, that those things happen. I think, of course, guys like Bill Gates get together with a guy like Jeffrey Epstein and a guy like Bill Clinton, and they talk and they make plans. But I don't know if there has to be necessarily like a super nefarious one world plan so much as a incentive structure in our managerial kind of development, which draws us to this. And so I wonder, you mentioned that the Birchers saw communism, they were anti-communism, but they saw that the one world government drive was beyond communism. It wasn't just communism. And I think that makes sense because today a lot of people will just mix up the two. They'll just say, oh, well, there's a one world government, and so like Klaus Schwab is also a communist. And it's like, I can see it if you turn your head slightly, but I don't know if they're the same thing. So I guess that's a lot of words to ask you a very basic question. Do you think that the current one world government we push now, is that a descendant of communism? Does it have communist aspects? Is it entirely free of communist infrastructure? Have we transcended communism into something else, a managerialism driving us towards this global one world government? What would many in the JBS say about kind of this development over time, which has proven their thesis right, that we are absolutely moving towards a one world government, but maybe not directly under, say, a strict communist understanding?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, Auron, and I would agree 100%, and I know most Birchers would as well. If you look at the powers that have been promoting communism, that have been using communism as a weapon to tear down societies, tear down the family, tear down the church so that you can build back better, to use the modern lexicon, they're not communists themselves, right? And I think part of this stems from a misunderstanding of communism itself. The traditional understanding of communism by your average Joe on the street is that this is some kind of ideology in favor of some kind of economic system. I think that's a flawed understanding. Welch actually called it a smoke screen for a cabal of power-hungry megalomaniacs who wanted to take over. And so they use this quote-unquote ideology to enlist the support of useful idiots so that they can kind of convince themselves that they're doing something good, all the while the masters behind the scenes know that they're just useful idiots, and that many of them, come revolution time, will end up being wiped out as well. So you look at, and there's a lot of pieces of evidence I could bring in here. David Rockefeller is a really interesting example. I don't think anybody could fairly accuse him of being a communist. He certainly was a big-time globalist. He was the leader of the Council on Foreign Relations. And yet he was almost always and everywhere very fond of communists. Him and Fidel Castro were like two peas in a pod. He went over to communist China in the early 1970s, and he comes back in 1973, writes in the New York Slimes a piece called From a China Traveler, where he says, and I'm quoting almost word for word here, that the social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most successful in human history. They had murdered about 50 million people up to that time. Now, do we believe that David Rockefeller was ready to give all his wealth to the proletariat? Of course not. Of course not, right? That's silly. So you go to one individual who helped shed a lot of light on kind of the workings of this establishment, if you will. He was a mentor to Bill Clinton. He was a professor at Georgetown University called Carroll Quigley. And he wrote a book that's very important. I have it right behind me. It's called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. And he kind of brags that he's been close to these people all his life. He's been close to their institutions. He says he agrees with their goals. And he describes the end goal as a political and economic system that can dominate the politics of every country and the economy of the world as a whole, that would be in the hands of a tiny elite, with the apex of the system being the Bank for International Settlements, where basically everything would be decided at secret meetings and conferences. And again, this is a guy who says he likes this. He's in support of it. His chief difference of opinion, he said, is that they want to be secret. He thinks they ought to be known. And he talks about this interesting relationship that these powers, as he describes them, the Anglo-American establishment, have with communism. He says they frequently collaborate and cooperate with communists and have no aversion to it. So I think that's really the way to understand it. I think the most important book ever written about communism that I know of was called Marx and Satan. It was written by a Romanian pastor who was tortured by communist savages for over a decade in Romania. And what he found was that Marx himself was not like the atheist, conspirator that we're led to believe. The guy was in partnership with Satan. So you kind of take everything that God teaches in the Bible: don't murder, don't steal, don't covet. You flip it exactly upside down. And that's what drives these people. And I should point out, when it comes to this idea of conspiracy, I grew up with these people, Auron. I went to the most elite international schools in the world. I grew up with the children of the people who are pushing this agenda forward. And most of them, if you ask them, they think of themselves as good people. They have different reasons for why they want this. We're going to end war. We're so much smarter than everybody else. This is going to be for their own good. That's the world I come out of. I obviously reject both of those ideas. But it goes back to what the Bible teaches. The idea of dividing mankind up into nations was not a human innovation, right? God told people after the flood, he said, spread out across the whole face of the earth and, be fruitful and multiply. And they said, no, we're good. We're just going to stay here and, just build this big, huge tower. And God eventually forces the issue. And twice in the scriptures, in Deuteronomy 32 and Acts 17, it says God divided mankind. He fixed the borders among the people. And so I think what we're really dealing with here is a diabolical effort to overturn all that is good, to smash any institution that is a rival to the total state. And communists are kind of useful idiots. And we see this throughout history. Karl Marx was financed by the League of the Just. The Soviet Revolution was financed by Wall Street, as documented by the great Stanford historian, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. His name was Anthony Sutton. Marvelous book. And then we spent decades building up the Soviet threat. We helped the communist Chinese take power, and we betrayed our ally Chiang Kai-shek. So over and over and over again, you see this pattern. And so I agree with you. There's not some overarching communist conspiracy. Communism is not an ideology at all. It's a smokescreen for a cabal of megalomaniacs trying to tear down national sovereignty, individual liberty, and ultimately Christian civilization.
Well, I think, 10 years ago, this is probably why people treated the Birchers that way at the time. But 10 years ago, if you had said, oh, well, we're really battling is a satanic inversion of, God's natural order, people would have been like, oh, okay, crazy pants. Now it's like, yeah, probably. Yeah, that sounds right. As the Church of Satan, celebrates abortions and child mutilations and, a state house somewhere with the sanction of the government, it's hard to, ignore that. Increasingly, the spiritual warfare aspect becomes more and more difficult. But this does lead us to an interesting, I think, problem a little bit for the Birchers here, which I'd like to bring up to you and see if you know what you think about this. But one of the points that Burnham made, of course, was that communism and fascism and liberal democracy were all just kind of racing towards totalitarianism. They all needed their own version of totalitarianism, but whether you're FDR or Hitler or Stalin, you're all trying to solve the same problem, one of massification and scale, right? Like that whatever your ideology is, you're more or less throwing that out the window to create, these kind of modern states. And one of the things I've noticed is that obviously Karl Marx was, famously said he was a fan of free trade because it dissolved national borders. He was hoping that ultimately the dissolution of national borders, the destruction of, this is why communists supported feminism, because it destroyed the family, and families are natural, are natural. They naturally prohibit the breaching of borders. They go ahead and support the natural formation of nations and peoples and those kind of things. And so they want these things to break down and destroy it. And so in some ways, kind of the unfettered free market seems to have a level of breaking down those very barriers, ones which Marx was hoping to build on. Now, ultimately, it failed for him. And, the Russian Revolution was not one that was spurred on by any kind of capitalism. It happened in a backwater, which seems to be the case in a lot of communist instances. So obviously this is a massive flaw with this theory, but ultimately the idea was that capitalism would kind of hollow out the characteristics of the nation, and then communism could swoop in and globalize everything after kind of feasting on the excess that capitalism had created. And so now that we see the main way that this kind of global conspiracy is deployed seems to be more neoliberal economics than perhaps classically Marxist understanding. What are then the implications for people like the JBS who want to support economic freedom, but also recognize that there has to be a level of preference for one's people, one's nation, one's tradition, one's God that might inhibit this free exchange? And if you don't have that, then eventually the Marxists can just come in and clean up what's left of your nation once it's been pulled apart.
Yeah, Marx was absolutely right about how free trade could be used and weaponized to undermine freedom, undermine national sovereignty, and ultimately undermine free markets. And I think it's important here to point out that unfettered free markets combined with human nature, which, as the Bible says, the heart is desperately wicked, can lead to serious problems. Free markets are not perfect. And if you allow wicked human beings to pursue, whatever their desires are, you're going to end up with, slavery and assassination services and things like this. So we have to start with the fundamental premise that our founding fathers discerned from the scriptures. They called it a self-evident truth. But we all have rights that come from God. God gave us a right to life. God gave us a right to liberty. God gave us a right to own property. And all of that framework needs to be combined with the moral code that we learn from the Christian system, from the biblical law, from the Ten Commandments that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And when you separate the two, you end up with a really significant problem. And I think the evildoers understand this very well. Today, we see the so-called idea of free trade being used to actually put nations in chains under the guise of free trade. The
Right.
European Union is a really good example. Hey, we're going to have free trade. Oh, and by the way, now we have a supranational government that's going to veto your own elected parliament's national budget. So they're using this concept of free trade absolutely to hollow out our national sovereignty, to build this international patchwork of regional governments. And so Marx had some things right. Obviously, he had some things very wrong. Gramsci later came back and said, well, why don't the advanced capitalist countries fall for this? Well, they got churches and families, so we got to infiltrate the cultural institutions. But ultimately, we have to recognize that this is really a battle against evil. And I don't think a lot of conservatives and even libertarians understand it. I think if we just present superior philosophical and rational arguments, then all the commies and all the destroyers of civilization are going to say, oh, okay, I'll come join your side now. That's not going to happen. A lot of these people are actually evil. And a lot of these people will exploit anything, whether it's free speech or free markets or anything, to advance that. And so that's why it's critical, as John Adams said, right? Our Constitution is fit only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the government of any other. You really cannot have a free society. You cannot have liberty if it's divorced from those principles that underpin what we used to call Christendom or the free world. Now, today, we often call it the West.
So before we go to the questions of the audience, Mr. Newman, what is the JBS up to now? How can people join, get involved if they want to join?
Well, what the JBS has always done is it picks the key issues that are essential for the survival of our country, for the survival of our freedom, and then it concentrates the efforts of its members all across the country and its supporters across the country to really move the ball down the line. So some of the ones working on right now get us out of the United Nations, right? There's a great bill in both houses of Congress, the Defund Act, disentangling, or yeah, it's not just defund, it's disentangling entirely from the United Nations Debacle Act. So that's one that the JBS is pushing really, really hard right now. Another is to save our children from public schools, from government indoctrination. If we keep handing our children over to these systems, we're going to lose the next generation, and it will be very difficult to ever recover from that. We're fighting efforts right now to change the Constitution. There are forces that they were trying to use liberals before. Now they're trying to use conservatives to convene a big conference that would open up our Constitution to being changed. So we're pushing back on that. Pushing against some of these very free trade agreements that we were just talking about that have been used to undermine our national sovereignty, pushing to end the Federal Reserve, right? They basically captured our money system, and they've used it now for generations to hollow out the middle class and basically buy up all our companies and our assets under the guise of free markets, to go back to what we were just discussing. So those are some of the key ones right now. People can find out more at jbs.org. You can kind of see what we're about, what projects are being worked on right now. There's a lot of different affiliates. The New American Magazine, where I serve as senior editor, is one. There's the Law Enforcement Charitable Foundation, working with law enforcement across the country. We produce the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief. Goes out to every police chief and sheriff in the country. There's a school that's an affiliate. I'm on the board of that. It's called the Freedom Project Academy. I've got over 1,000 students around the world. K through 12 online classical Christian school. So lots of different options for people to get involved in their own way. And I would encourage people to just go check it out and see what you think.
There you go, guys. Publications, schools, everything you would need to know about getting involved and understanding what the JBS is all about. All right, let's go to the questions of the people real quick. Cherry Coke Nixon says, growing up means being disillusioned about Bill Buckley and Reagan. JBS becoming a Dylan song shows corporate media treated it as the QAnon of its time. Is it in a Dylan song? I'm trying to remember all of a sudden.
Yes.
Do you know which one?
I do. Bob Dylan made a song kind of making fun of the JBS, acting like JBS was extreme and kooky. And I think it's interesting that before he died, Bob Dylan did that famous interview where he kind of admitted that he had sold his soul to the chief commander, clearly a reference to Satan. So, do with it what you will.
Jay Warville says William Buckley did far more damage and neutered the right than the left ever did. I mean, yes, obviously, if you're controlling the ability to push back against the left, you're going to make sure that you have no real opposition, which is going to create the most damage possible. Nixon says the CRA, VRA, to quote Oliver, it's the current year. Yeah, well, it continues to be with us and cause quite a bit of problems, which, I know it's a far climb and many people will mock me for it, but I'm going to continue to be pushing that the CRA needs to go. And until we get that done, we simply cannot have a free America living under the actual Constitution. We will simply be ruled by this second Constitution. Let's see here. Nixon also says murdered JBS chairman Larry McDonald equaled patriot. I'm not familiar with that history. Could you clue us in real quickly about what he's talking about there?
Yeah, this was a horrific tragedy. I'll try to give the abbreviated version. So in 1983, Congressman Larry McDonald was the chairman of the John Birch Society, a great patriot. He was a Democrat, but don't hold that against him. He was a very conservative Democrat, a hardcore constitution, probably the most constitutionalist member of Congress, maybe with Congressman Ron Paul. And he got on an airplane. He was on his way to South Korea, to celebrate freedom. And the Soviets shot his plane out of the sky. This was in September of 1983. They claimed that they killed everybody on board. We have very good reason to believe and very strong evidence that the plane actually made an emergency landing, that he was kidnapped by the Soviets, taken to Moscow. Terrible things. But yeah, and I think the reason they had to take out McDonald, he was basically unstoppable. I mean, he had, I think, 250 members of Congress show up at his funeral. There was a lot of talk of him becoming president. He famously debated William Buckley. He was becoming very, very well known. They threw everything at him to try to dislodge him from his congressional district, and they were unable to. And I think if he had not been taken out like this, there was a very real chance he could have been president, or at least caused such a splash that it would be impossible for the evildoers to proceed.
Manayud says, the more I read about history, the more I realize we have been here before. Yes, that's why they encourage you not to read history, because then you might be able to figure out what's going on. It's amazing what you can do with just a little bit of context. All of a sudden, the news isn't quite so confusing. Political maneuvers aren't quite so inexplicable. Buggo says, does JBS believe in American exceptionalism?
No question that members of the Birch Society and the leadership believe that America is an exceptional nation. That's one of the reasons why we focus so much on the Constitution, the wisdom of the Founding Fathers, the Declaration of Independence, which, of course, they didn't invent all this stuff. This was synthesized from, as you said, an in-depth study of world history, of the Bible. But that made America very exceptional. Today, obviously, we have gone far afield. We have started trying to destroy the foundations of our country. And so if that continues, we will not be exceptional for much longer. But as currently constituted, we have a marvelous Constitution framed by incredibly brilliant individuals, and that makes our nation very, very exceptional.
Manayud says, Bill Buckley Jr. Compared all of Ayn Rand's works to a miscarriage after her death. Say what you will about her writing or her philosophy, but she did not deserve to be treated this way.
Yeah. It's true. They recently at the National Review attacked Phyllis Schlafly. I mean, really? Yeah. What is going on over there? It's a disgrace.
I mean, at this point, I'm pretty sure that you can just say the National Review is, well, on the side of inverted hierarchies. We'll just put it that way. Manayud also says, Ephesians 6:12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Amen. Absolutely something we must remember at all times. To the Chicken says, how about getting out of the Five Eyes system?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the JBS has always held to the same belief as the Founding Fathers, that we don't want permanent alliances. We don't want entangling relationships with other governments. America should stand on its own. We should be an example and a role model to the world. But especially when you consider the current state of the UK with the takeover by the Fabians, Australia, these are nations that are rapidly leaving the fold of kind of Anglo-Saxon Christian traditional history. And, I don't know that we need to be sharing intelligence with or collaborating in that way with governments that castrate children and kill babies and are working to sell out their populations for a one world tyranny.
Alex, it's been really amazing because I spent my whole life hearing from conservatives how deeply, deeply we care about, the Founding Fathers and their beliefs and these things. And then I, quote those pesky lines from George Washington's farewell address about not having these long extended foreign, alliances. And all of a sudden, those rock-ribbed conservatives who care very deeply about the principles of our founders, they have all these reasons why we just should actually ignore those entirely and throw it in the trash. And actually, it turns out maybe I'm an anti-Semite and maybe I'm some kind of isolationist or maybe I'm a fascist for some reason. It's so strange how George Washington's words continue to be so dangerous to people who pretend to be conservatives today. It's really like turning light on a vampire. It's been an amazing thing to watch over and over again. But I probably don't have to tell you that. These are probably things you're very familiar with. But it has been a wonder to behold. I never thought I'd make so many conservatives angry with George Washington. But
it really is incredible. And then, of course, George Washington was just one among many who called this out. And, as free people, we can support any other country or government we want. But that doesn't mean that our government has to be involved in taking our money at gunpoint or worse, borrowing it from communist China to give to other countries. It's foolishness. Our founders were exactly correct.
And then finally, Mr. Nixon said, chat loves having Alex Newman on. Come again. Well, yes, I think this has been a fantastic conversation, and I have no doubt that we will see Mr. Newman on the show once again. Well, Alex, thank you once again for coming on. It has been fantastic, very informative. I hope people now have a better understanding of what the JBS is all about, the history, the interactions with different conservative luminaries like Mr. Buckley, and perhaps how they can plug in if they would like to get involved. Guys, if it's your first time on this channel, of course, you need to subscribe on YouTube, click the bell and notifications so you know when we go live. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform. And I will be hosting the Tim Pool Show tonight. So if you would like to tune in, say hi, we'd love to have you. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And again, I'll talk to you guys next time.